Hello, I'm Simon Whistler, you're watching TopTenzNet, and in the video today, the top 10 common myths about the United States government. The United States government was built by the founders with many layers in order to ensure a better union. By having so many checks and balances and separation of powers, anyone who tried to pull a hostile takeover of the government or turn it into something less democratic would find an incredible amount of resistance from multiple angles. While this system does have a lot of advantages, it can also be very confusing even to those who live in the United States because of the staggering complexity of the entire system. The United States government and many of its functions or responsibilities are often misunderstood by the average citizen. Number 10. There is no the government in the United States. One of the favorite claims you will hear from any conspiracy theorist is that there is something called the government. These theorists seem convinced that the United States government is a vast monolithic entity that is always sharing information and working towards the same goals. In a way, it seems to give them a feeling of security that the government is all-powerful and able to watch out for them and protect them despite their constant fear-mongering. However, they are greatly exaggerating the competence and the coordination of the United States government. The government is made up of the legislative, judicial, and executive branches, all of which have people within them with radically opposing viewpoints. These people all have their own goals to make the world a better place, and like most politicians, they have their secrets. The USA also has powerful state governments with similar setups. Dotted throughout the country are police departments that rarely have to answer much to anyone and cooperate with each other mostly on a good faith basis. Then, of course, there are all of the sheriff's departments as well, which are elected officials and have different rules and authority than the police do. And then, if that wasn't enough, there are many spy agencies and several different military branches with many subgroups within them. Many of these groups, for secrecy reasons, only share information on a strictly need-to-know basis, so they may share certain surface details to avoid bungling into each other, but it is highly unlikely in most cases that they know exactly what the other agencies or military branches are planning. In a way, the United States government is sort of like a centipede with all of the legs moving in awkward directions. Number 9. The claims of military dominance are true, but they're somewhat misleading. One of the proudest boasts of the United States and many of the citizens is that they spend more on the military and have a more powerful and well-equipped military than anyone else in the world. Now, we aren't saying this boast isn't true, although Russia does have a few more nukes, but it does leave out some important details. Diplomacy is a subtle game, and showing off your military dominance is often a great way to get enemies to the negotiating table without you having to lift a finger. However, if this type of diplomacy is done in a less subtle way, your enemy may become even more belligerent, and now you either risk looking weak or being forced to invade. Now, the United States could probably invade and take out a lot of small nations, but they do not want to be forced to do so. The truth is that much of the military spending it actually goes towards maintenance on even some fairly recent equipment, because maintaining the most powerful military in the world is incredibly expensive. And then there's the fact that if you go to war, that expense bill is going to increase enormously. However, that maintenance is actually only a small part of the cost of a sustained occupation, which can cause a real hit to the budget of even a world superpower like the USA. Despite taking control of Iraq and Afghanistan fairly easily initially, with almost no losses, the actual sustained occupation was extremely costly, both in money and lives. Number 8. The power of the president is still greatly exaggerated. Many people have been trying to educate others on this one for some time, but it doesn't really seem to take hold. While some people are always going to be angry with whoever is in office and direct most of their anger towards them, they are allowing others at fault to conveniently avoid any real attention and keep up their work completely unheeded. Now, the President of the US does have certain powers, but outside of signing or vetoing legislation, actions made by the President can be reversed by the next President to take power, as they are not permanently binding without a full act of Congress and could be fairly easily blocked by either Congress or the courts. One of the greatest real powers of the president is simply the amount of attention they get, which they can use to shape the public mindset and act as a leader for their party or for a specific ideology. However, their power is much more limited than many people realize. The leaders of the House and Senate have great power to bring forth legislation to the president's desk, and it is extremely rare to see the House or Senate minority or majority leader running for president. They already have an extremely powerful position, and they do not have to deal with nearly as much much of the people's ire if they dislike a decision. Many of them would likely see the presidency as something of a downgrade. There are also those in the judicial branch, especially the Supreme Court, who wield tremendous influence and power. A swing vote on the Supreme Court can shape the face of the country, and they have their position until they either retire or they die. Number 7. Free speech only applies to the government limiting your speech. This pops up on message boards and in public places of business and just about everywhere else you can imagine. People will be told in some way by someone in authority to be quiet or tone down the type of thing they are saying, and the person will go on a rant about freedom of speech and how their First Amendment rights are being violated. Or then there's the case where some public figure will lose their job for something they said in an interview, and their fans will claim that the First Amendment is being stomped on. However, the First Amendment is really specific, and it's not really interested in what private citizens or places of business do. The First Amendment states that the government cannot abridge your speech or the speech of the press, and that people have a reasonable right to public assembly to address their grievances. All this means is that the government has to give you a reasonable accommodation if you ask for a public protest and cannot punish you for what you say or put you in jail for it. However, this does not mean a private place of business or private website has to put up with you, nor does it mean your employer has to give you a platform to express your views that are antithetical to them. However, this does not mean that a private place of business or a private website or your employer has to put up with you. Free speech protects you from government retaliation, but retaliation from any sort of private entity, that's a totally different matter. Number 6. Anti-discrimination laws are on the books, but that doesn't mean proving it is easy. Sometimes it happens that someone gets kicked out of an established place of business that is open for the public. For whatever reason, the incident gets attention and people argue about whether the people involved were racist or not when the people kicked out were not white. Now, this is understandable considering the history of the United States, but in all of these cases, many people are incensed that no prosecutor or lawyer seems interested in trying to punish someone for a civil rights violation or prosecute them with a hate crime. While it may seem obvious to some people watching a video from a distance, proving something like intent in a court of law can be a whole lot more difficult. While civil rights laws now disallow discrimination based on skin color and the like, public businesses can refuse to serve anyone for really any non-illegal reason they want. And as long as they can come up with something remotely reasonable sounding, the police will make you leave and ask you not to come back. In some cases, the person who was asked to leave could have been the victim of racial discrimination and did nothing wrong, but the trick is proving that this has actually happened. If taken to court, the owner or manager of the establishment could just give some kind of reason like they were making staff uncomfortable or customers had complained or something really hard to disprove. To win a case like this, you'd practically have to have a tape of someone calling someone racial slurs or the like, and it's fairly rare for that type of outburst to be caught on film. Number 5. The post office is a part of the government but requires no tax revenue. The United States Postal Service is an agency that has confused a lot of people. Some people actually believe it is completely distinct from the United States government. This is not the case, or that it is a private corporation owned by the government, kind of like Amtrak. However, the USPS was actually founded back in the days of Benjamin Franklin, who became the first Postmaster General. He wanted the agency to have a certain level of independence, but he still wanted it to be a part of the US government. The Postal Reconstruction Act of 1971 did change the USPS, but it did not remove it from the federal government or make it a private entity, and USPS employees are still federal employees with all of the related benefits. This confusion likely stems from the fact that since the Act, the USPS is expected to take care of all of its operating expenses simply by the costs that it charges for its services. It does not exist to make a profit, and it does not take your tax dollars. It takes a fair price for the service provided and does its constitutionally mandated duty to provide that service to all Americans, no matter what. Number 4. Yes, Puerto Rico is indeed a part of the United States of America. Recently, there was a news story about a Puerto Rican couple being turned away by a clerk at a Motel 6 who told them that he needed an American ID and that ID from Puerto Rico did not count as such. Some people thought that the clerk was being malicious, but it's more than likely that he was just confused. The truth is that over 40% of Americans are actually completely unaware that Puerto Ricans are fellow citizens and that their territory is considered part of America. Now, this is possibly in part due to the fact that Americans get little exposure to United States territories. The Hawaiian Islands are a very popular tourist destination, but Puerto Rico, Guam, the US Virgin Islands, American Samoa, and the Northern Mariana Islands are as isolated from the mainland as Hawaii and are simply not as popular spots. It would do well, however, for Americans to get a better knowledge of all US territories and learn more about the intricacies of what makes up America. The only thing a Puerto Rican needs to get into the United States of America and stay as long as they wish is their Puerto Rican ID or passport, since they have already been in America their entire lives to begin with. Number 3. English is not the official language of the United States of America. Some people will get confused and start talking about how in America you speak English and not any other language. They will demand this of others and suggest people should be forced to assimilate or they should leave. Now, this misunderstanding stems partly from the fact that English is by far the most spoken language in the country and is used for almost everything written down. But that doesn't mean it's a fact. There are roughly 500 languages that are spoken in the US today, and the federal government of the United States does not recognize any of them as the official language of the country. It has been proposed before, but it's never actually succeeded except in a few states. At this point, several states have passed laws stating that their state's official language is English, but this still does nothing, at least yet, to change any federal laws or statutes. In truth, there's not really any point making anything official. Most people speak it, most people use it for written communication, and there is rarely any confusion. There's also the argument that making an official language would violate the First Amendment. Even if English were made the official language, there are still some people who would struggle with it and keep speaking mostly in their native language, and other citizens would be happy to use their own language skills to help them fit in, as humans tend to do. Number 2. The jury system is not foolproof, and jury nullification can be used for good or ill. The jury system and the justice system in general, on the face of things, seem like a really good idea. Everyone has a fair and speedy trial, and no cruel or unusual punishments are allowed. Forced interrogations are a thing of the past, and people are presumed innocent instead of guilty. In many ways, it is a paragon of proper justice, but every system has its flaws, and one of the biggest ones in the United States is the ability for juries, if the entire group is in sync, to simply decide to do what they want and tell the judge to take his instructions and the law and the witnesses and stuff it. This is something called jury nullification, but it can also be used to ensure someone's guilt. Now, it says that you will have a jury of your peers, but this is extremely dubious. No precedent has ever been followed to make sure the people judging you are a part of your peer group, so you just end up with whoever is local to that courthouse. In some cases, to prevent abuse, a trial is moved to an entirely different geography for jury toxicity reasons, but this is not always possible. In the Old South, in the United States of America, many people who were obviously guilty of lynching got away with it due to friendly juries. And of course, on the other side of things, many black people ended up in jail because of unfriendly juries. This isn't to say that the jury system is biased all or even much of the time, but there are certainly improvements that could be made. Number 1, the Supreme Court may seem insanely powerful, but they do not have the final say. Many people get very upset when the Supreme Court does something, and people from both parties will accuse them of being activist judges or something similar. It is quite common to suggest that the justices are actually trying to legislate from the bench and using their lifelong position to control the country in an entirely inappropriate way. This misconception likely stems from people thinking that the Supreme Court has the final say on everything. The Supreme Court's job is not to legislate or tell politicians what to do. It is to evaluate laws based on the Constitution and decide if the Constitution is being properly respected. However, laws can be changed to narrowly fit requirements, and they can be passed again, or a constitutional amendment can be made to override the Supreme Court entirely. If something like this was to occur in response, it's not like the Supreme Court could just step in. Even if the justices thought the new constitutional amendment was incompatible with the rest of the Constitution without more drastic changes, they could not actually do anything until someone had challenged it in court and it had properly worked its way up the ladder. Even if they wanted to hear a case as soon as possible, they'd have to wait for it to reach them. In the end, as much as some people may complain about them, they are just interpreters of the Constitution. They are not legislators or executives. So I really hope you enjoyed that video, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel for brand new videos every day of the week. Also, I've got another channel, it's called Biographics. It's biographies of notable people from the present day, as well as history from Elon Musk to Osama bin Laden. You can check it out through the icon on the screen now. But if you want something else to watch right now, why not check out another TopTenz video or a Biographics video over there on the right. And as always, thank you for watching.